All right, we are here in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and what we're about to read here might be a little foreign to us because the practice we are about to read here is not really one that we have today, but there's definitely principles we can learn from it. But he says, "Keep thy foot when thou goest into the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil." So what's he talking about here? When we go into the house of God, we got to be careful. We need to be ready to hear. We need to be ready to listen. And we need to be ready to learn more than we're ready to speak. And when he talks about speaking, what's he talking about? Well, it's about basically making pledges and making proclamations of things that we are going to do. Sometimes, so he's basically just saying, hey, when you go to the house of God, just why don't you be more ready to listen and learn something than to just go there and say something? Because when you go there and you say something, you make some kind of pledge, you are going to be obligated to follow through with that pledge. So verse 2 says, "Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven and upon the earth. Therefore let thy words be few." Nobody's commanding you to go, make some kind of pledge. Nobody is commanding you to say something. So why don't you keep your words to a minimum? Because again, you are going to be expected to follow through with what you say. It says, "For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by a multitude of words. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it. For he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldst not vow than that thou shouldst vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin, neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thine hands?" So it's about vowing vows. Don't be too quick to just promise something, because you're going to be expected to do it. I was just having a conversation recently with someone, and we were talking about church planning, and I was talking about a lot of the different churches that helped us. And then this individual was like, he's like, "Well, what about Pastor so-and-so? I'm sure he helped you guys too." And I was like, "Well, actually, to be honest, he didn't do anything." and I said, when I told him, I was like, and I'm not, trying to be mean, but because he kept, every time I would see this preacher, he's like, "Man, I'm excited about your church plant. We're going to do something for you. We're going to help you. We're going to do something." And he just forgot about it. He never did anything. But every time I would see him, he's like, "Our church is going to do something for you, monetarily speaking." And I had a couple different pastors that were always telling me they were going to do stuff for us. And let me tell you, in those early days, too, I was like, man, I really hope those guys come through at some point, because we could really use the help right now. And you know what? They never came through. But at the same time, and you know what? That kind of aggravated me. Now, those guys didn't need to say anything. I didn't ask them for anything. They literally approached me saying, "We're going to help you," and they never did anything. While there were several other pastors that never said anything, and they just helped. I mean, there were some churches that they just sent random checks. There was one pastor that sent a check. I didn't even know he knew who I was, but heard about our church plant. We weren't real far from him, and he wanted to be a help and a blessing, and that was a huge blessing. And so the thing is, there's a great lesson for all of us here. Rather than telling everybody what we're going to do, how about we just shut up and then just do it? And all the things that people have said they were going to do for this church over the years, people always like, "We're going to do this, we're going to move to your church." It's never the people that tell you they're going to do it. It's always the people that just show up. That's the way it typically goes. So that's another lesson for another day. But I do want to make application on this principle here about making vows and running your mouth when it comes to standards. Last week we were talking about standards and hypocrisy. And I don't want to repeat all of that, but I do want to just review a couple things that are important, and that is that we covered last week. And if you didn't hear last week's message, make sure you go back and listen to it. But standards are, in fact, a list of rules that man came up with, and that's okay. While God's commands do not change, application of those commands do change over time, and that's okay. Standards are something we can only set for areas where we have authority. Don't go setting standards for things where you don't have authority. Keep your mouth shut when it comes to that. And Baptists often go wrong by speaking for all people in all time eras and all cultures. And that's not right either. I heard a preacher say one time, old-time religion is right for all places, for all cultures. North and south of the Mason-Dixon line, he's basically saying. And then he proceeded to talk about a style of church. And it's just like, do we really think Paul preached with a southern accent and that they were running glory laps in Corinth? Well, in Corinth, they might have been running glory laps. But in some of these other churches, in Galatia, they were running glory laps. Come on, that's cultural, buddy. Watch out for stuff like that. But Baptists go wrong with that. And churches absolutely should set some standards when it comes to dress, music in their church. They have every right to do that. Where they go wrong, though, is when they put an expectation on those outside their realm of authority and expect everyone to just follow what they dictated. And then when they go as far as teaching it like it's doctrine, that's wrong. We have no right to do that. We have no right to declare someone a compromiser for not following our standard when they are under our authority, or especially if they never took a particular stand in that area. That's not them compromising. But we do. We draw lines to identify ourselves with those we want to identify with. And we sometimes draw lines to separate ourselves from those that we do not want to identify with. Okay? And Baptists go wrong trying to make a standard Bible. For example, we have a wooden pulpit in this church. You know why we have a wooden pulpit? It has nothing to do with Ezra standing on a pulpit of wood. Has nothing to do with that. You know what it is? It's an identifier. Most Baptist churches that we want to identify with have wooden pulpits. Now, is it a sin to have a lectern or a bistro table? No. But we're not going to get one. You know why? Because I don't want to identify with the churches that have lecterns and bistro tables. And I don't want somebody to get the wrong idea when they come in here. I want when people to come in here to think they're in an independent fundamental Baptist church. And so there's a certain look that we want to have. There's certain things that we're not going to bring in. We're not going to bring in purple lights. Not because purple lights are a sin, but because it identifies you with something. And you know what? If purple lights ever identify you with old-fashioned King James fundamental fire and brimstone preaching, then we'll get some purple lights. But it's not there right now, and so we don't have that. We have regular lights in this church. These are identifiers. But some preachers, they'll pull something out of the Bible to show purple lights are a sin. And we can't do that. No, these are just standards that we set. And so if somebody does, they bring in the purple lights, and you're like, nope, they're out of here. But that could change. That could change. So you know what I'm not going to do? As long as I'm the pastor of Liberty Baptist Church, there'll never be a purple light in this church. Okay? I shouldn't do that. I feel like doing that. At this moment right now, I almost feel like that might be the right thing to do, but I got to watch it. I don't want to give the sacrifice of fools. Because again, what if one of these days, all the IFB churches, that's how you identify them, and it's all the lectern churches that have regular lights. Well, I don't want to identify with them. So I know that's kind of weird, that's kind of a weird thing, but I think you all get the point. And so it's okay to follow the standards of those who've proven themselves godly. And when we as a church make a decision to set standards somewhere, we don't have the right to expect the whole world to fall in line with us. That's dumb. Okay? And again, a standard, it's just like it's like a line we say, we know over here this is bad, and we don't want to cross that line. For example, too, even when it comes to music and specials. Okay? There are some churches where people get up and they do performances where they showcase themselves, and I don't think that's right. And some people don't want to do that, so they have a standard, no special music. Okay? Now, if they want to set that standard for their church, that's fine. We don't need to criticize somebody if we want to call it a higher standard than ours, we can, or even a lower standard. We don't have a right to criticize that. But just because they have decided they're going to draw the line there, that would be ridiculous if they thought everyone should. And I don't know any pastors that are that way. I've known people who follow pastors and expect every church to follow theirs. We had the one lady here that because her favorite pastor didn't have special music at his church, she would always wait till the special music was over to come walking in to every service. She showed up, I started noticing, she showed up every service right after the special music was over. That's weird. Okay? Listen, that's a standard for another church. They can have that, but if a pastor were to have that standard and declare all churches that have special music liberal or something, or in sin, well, that's just dumb. And we can't do that we can't be the same way if somebody has a standard that's a little more loose than ours. We've got to watch out for that. We don't want to cross lines when it comes to these things. And so, right here, though, I said it's kind of where, I mentioned last week, too, how as a pastor, I don't have an authority to set a standard in your home, nor do other men have authority to set standards in other men's homes. And as a pastor, I am not going to get in a contest with church members of who has the highest standard. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going, I think it's ridiculous. And right here's where we mainly left off last week. And I don't want to, I really want to spend some time on this, because this also takes us to another subject I've been wanting to talk about, because this is something I have observed over many years of being in the ministry. And I want to talk about standards and compromise. Because something we often, Baptist preachers lament about, is people having standards and preaching standards and then later dropping those standards, compromising on those standards. And I want to talk about that, because that is important, that we understand exactly what standards are, and that we be careful not to go around declaring these super strict standards only to go dropping them later. There's, I'm making a vow today that I will never allow my family to do whatever. And then later I'm doing that. I just sang the song of fools. I made myself look bad. So be careful what you say about these things, because, the reality is no one likes a compromiser. Nobody likes a compromiser, and compromise is a bad word in the IFB world. Nobody likes a compromiser. And this area of standards is where I've seen many Baptists make drastic changes, and typically it's when their children become teenagers. And I have been very blessed to have been growing up in the ministry. I've always been careful when it comes to certain standards, because I didn't want to be that guy who was just all beating his chest about how hardcore standards were, only to dump them as soon as my children become teenagers. That happens all the time. And we don't want to be that way. A lot of IFB people, in fact, the mouthiest IFB people are usually mouthy before their kids are teenagers. It always changes after their kids become teenagers. And if that's the case, there's something wrong. If what we're doing is right, it ought to work while our kids are teenagers as well. It ought to be something that continues if it is, in fact, legit. And so when it comes to setting standards, the last things we want to do is go take a strong stand and then turn around later and change it. And then it's especially bad, and this is what preachers do. They'll change their standard, but then they try to act like they didn't change. No, you changed. Okay? Hey, just be honest. You dropped your standard. Okay? Just be honest. You gave the sacrifice of fools. Maybe you were wrong in how high you set that standard, but can you just admit it? Can you admit that you were wrong? Could you admit that you preached and you manipulated people in your church for years, and you were putting expectations on people that were unrealistic, that you weren't able to live up to, and that you called those people compromisers when they gave up on those things? Can you at least admit that you did that, instead of acting like you didn't drop the standard, instead of acting like you didn't change? No, you changed. You changed. And I'm not even saying that you shouldn't have changed. Maybe you should never have made that vow. Maybe you never should have set that standard so high. Maybe that was unrealistic. Maybe it was foolish what you decided that you were going to do. There's some things that it's too hard. There's some things, we can go too extreme on. People can't possibly live up to these things. Don't just go declaring, I believe that I've taken a stand that every Christian should read their Bible 4 hours a day and pray 6 hours a day. You can't keep that going forever. Don't declare that a standard. Oh, for as long as I live, I'm going to do that. No, don't. Listen, if you're going to declare that, you better do it. And so if it's something that's beyond what you're able to do, just keep your mouth shut about it. And when it comes to standards, Baptists have ran their mouths so much on some of these things that they can't take these things back. And As a result, they have a choice. I've either got to compromise or I've got to continue trying to ask my family to do something that's impossible, which is going to turn them away from the things of God, or I've got to be a fake. I've got to pretend I'm still doing it when we're not really doing it. We don't want to do any of these things. And so this subject, it's getting a lot of Baptists in trouble, and it's very important when it comes to your home that you set standards. But if you want them to be things that you will do while your kids are teenagers, and something too that they will follow and that they will continue to do, then you better have some standards that are reasonable. And so what are some things you can do to set some standards that you're not going to compromise on? Okay? What can you do? So first thing, don't be over the top. Don't be over the top when it comes to your standards. Did you know higher standards does not necessarily equal higher godliness? Did you know that? In fact, the higher you set your standard, the more you might be making yourself into a hypocrite. Which is what we talked about last week. It says in Matthew 23, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." Notice how these Pharisees, they were so ultra hardcore on their tithing, on every little thing. They were tithing on it. But at the same time, on more important things, they were ignoring it. Now, the thing is, most people, and that was good they were tithing on these things, but it just made them look like a bigger hypocrite. Because they're obsessing over these things that don't really matter, but in the things that really do matter and affect other people, they're ignoring those things. So it just makes you a bigger hypocrite. And that's how a lot of Christians are, and Baptists are some of the best at this. What a lot of Baptists do is, and typically people who have big problems, is they will just declare, all right, for example, how you dress is the biggest marker of righteousness. And that's just kind of what they think in their mind and what they try to tell everybody else. So what they do, they try to just be the most hardcore about how they dress. They dress the most old-fashioned. They make their wife wear a burqa or something like that. And therefore, they're the most righteous, even though their marriage is miserable, their family's miserable, even though, the guy's a deadbeat, he can't keep a job. They have all these terrible problems. And I have seen this. I could tell stories. I could name names of people who had massive failures in their life, but guess who was the most conservatively dressed family? They were. My wife will remember these people. We were at a camp meeting one time, and there was one of these families by us. They had all the kids, a bunch of kids, dressed old school, and this guy sat behind us through the whole camp meeting. And the only time he would shout was whenever they'd start preaching about women in pants, and then he would come unglued, man. He would he'd about run glory laps. While his wife looks, anyway, I won't talk about her. But, it was pretty revolting. And then I find out later that this over-the-top, judgmental guy who, when he was in a church, was super judgmental on everybody, real down on everybody, this guy turned out he had another kid from a previous relationships. And so, the guy had a past. Some people have a past. You would think those people would be a little more merciful, but this guy too, he had the authorities looking for him because he wasn't paying his child support like he was supposed to. And it's like, wait a minute. You've got all this stuff in your past, and you are being so critical of everyone else because of how they dress. That's pretty bad. You're not providing for your child. You're not taking care of your kid. That's pretty bad right there. That's not a good thing at all, but that's typically how these people are. For some people in our world and churches like ours, the greatest marker of righteousness is that you go soul winning and that you say bad things about sodomites. And if you do those things, it doesn't matter how bad you treat people. It doesn't matter. You can have no faithfulness. You can be a bad husband. You can be a bad father. But as long as you go soul winning and as long as you're posting stuff against the sodomites, you're a hardcore Christian. And you get to trash on all the pre-tribbers, who are more godly than you are. because at least you're right on eschatology. See, well, that's what we do. Everybody does. They're always setting the standard real high in one area, ignoring more important things. And you know what it is? It just makes you a bigger hypocrite. It makes you a bigger hypocrite when you do all that stuff. Hey, how about you do the most important things first? How about you have judgment and mercy? How about you love the Lord? How about you love your neighbor? And higher standards do not necessarily equal higher godliness. Many people's standards too, they aren't realistic. This is why you got to watch your mouth. And back to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. He said, be ready more to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. When they're going and declaring they're going to do all these things and they don't do them, that is evil. Be not rash with thy mouth. Think about what you are about to pledge to do. Before you go and tell your family, we're doing this, we're whatever. Before you do all those things, you know what? You better make sure that it's the right decision. You better make sure that this is a conviction for you, that you're not just jumping on a bandwagon with everybody else. And and this is especially important too, if you're somebody, like when my wife and I got married, my wife knew that she was going to be marrying an independent fundamental Baptist preacher. And so, and she was from an independent fundamental Baptist home, so she didn't have to make any drastic changes, but it was very clear exactly the kind of life we were going to live when we got married. She signed up for this. Now, I do think we ought to have some patience when a guy gets saved after he's already been married. And then all of a sudden, he starts learning about all this IFB stuff. You know what? Be patient on your wife. Be patient on your children too. Some people, they don't get saved until their kids are teenagers. Hey, these changes are going to drastically affect them. And sometimes I've heard stories of parents, yeah, I went through and I went in my daughter's closet and I started throwing away all her clothes. Hey, listen, let's not make her bitter against independent fundamental Baptists. And they will go do all these extreme things. They'll thump their chests. They'll make them binge watch sermons about dress standards and things like that. And then they wonder why their family hates the IFB when they grow up. They wonder why they call it a cult and all these things. And maybe too is because 14 different times you kept changing your stand. You take the stand, then you go away from it, and you do it again. 4 different times you threw all your wife's pants out and things like that. It's like, why don't you figure out what you actually believe and then do it? And in the meantime, just keep your mouth shut. Just, chill. Don't do things that are unrealistic. It's okay to set high goals, but understand sometimes we might need to come to the realization that we aim too high, and we might need to make some adjustments. And we can do that easily if we haven't ran our mouth. For example, too, like, I want to get in shape. I'm only going to eat 1,000 calories a day, and I'm going to run 5 miles, and I'm going to do all these things. Hey, that's a great goal. But you know what? If that gets too hard, and if you start, dying from just not enough calories and all those things, it's okay for you to maybe back off and say, maybe I need to go down to 4 miles. Maybe I need to go up to 1,500 calories or something like that. Just don't go running your mouth about things. Set high goals, but don't go declaring these things. And everyone who does anything different is a sinner. I believe this because I believe the Bible. No, I'm setting a goal for myself. Go ahead and set a goal. I want to read through my Bible this many times in a year. Go ahead and set goals. I want to pray this much, but don't go out there making these vows and proclaiming these things like, if you're not doing it this much, you're a bad Christian. No, don't do that, because now you're obligated to do all these things. Give yourself some area for adjustment, because you might need it. I think you're just being weak. No, I'm just being realistic. I am not commanded to go over the top. I am not commanded to make these vows. If you're going to go declare these things, this is the ordinance for the McMurtry home from henceforth and forever. Well, then it needs to be the ordinance for the McMurtry home from henceforth and forever, and it better be something reasonable. It better be something realistic. It better be something that's not just going to turn your family away from the things of God. So show wisdom in who you choose to follow when it comes to standards. And by the way, we're all following someone when it comes to standards. Okay, ladies and how they do their hair, they're following somebody. Why? Proof of that is we can go back in any of your photo albums in any decade, and we can tell what decade you're in by the hairstyle you have. Okay, why is that? Because everybody follows certain trends and things, okay? And that's not all bad, okay? Whether it be, you can tell what decade somebody's from a lot of times by their glasses. I mean, just there's all kinds of things that, it shows certain trends and cultural trends and things that are going on. And so we're all following people, but who are we following? That's important. And Hebrews 13:7 says, remember them which have the rule over you, who have spoken unto you the word of God, whose faith follow, considering the end of their conversation. Y'all see that? Considering the end of their conversation. And let me tell you, many IFB leaders speaking the loudest about standards couldn't even get their own children to follow them. I mean, folks, and I have seen this. The two people running their mouths the most about standards in the IFB are young punks trying to look hardcore and old dudes who couldn't get their families to follow their standards. I was shocked. I remember one time there was an evangelist that I knew, and we were at a camp meeting, and we were staying in the same hotel as them, and I had seen this evangelist several times at different meetings, but I had never seen his wife before, and his wife was there, and I remember his wife was there in a pair of pants, and I'm like, what in the world? And my dad's like, oh yeah, she's always wore pants. And I was like, I've heard him rip on women wearing pants. And he's like, yeah. It was like everybody knew this about him. He would rip on women wearing pants everywhere he went, and his wife wore pants. It was just like, what in the world? It was the weirdest thing, and it was always that way. I don't know. I just thought that kind of made him look like a hypocrite. But I mean, today there's older preachers out there still ripping on standards, ripping on the compromisers. None of their family followed what they teach. I've been teaching this my whole life. Yeah, and you couldn't get your own family to do it. You know why? Because they were over the top. They went too far. They declared these things as sins. They didn't teach them right. They didn't explain, again, why we have these standards. These standards, they identify us. They're areas where we draw lines, where we have authority, and not necessarily everything that is outside where our standard is a sin. And we're supposed to do these things because we're convinced of them, not just going with the flow. I mean, there's so many things that are being preached on when it comes to standards. It's just factually wrong. Even when I agree with what they're trying to get people to do, no, you're factually and you're biblically wrong in how you're preaching it. And you for sure are wrong in the way you're treating other people whose standards are different than you. And so we've got to watch out about this. And in the IFB, when people go over the top, one of two things typically happens. This is what's going to happen when you go over the top. You're either going to compromise as soon as your children become teenagers and you're going to look like a compromiser, or you're not going to compromise and your families are going to be miserable and your teenagers are going to hate you and they're going to hate the IFB, and as soon as they become adults, they're throwing it all out. And they're going to throw out everything. They're going to throw out the standards and they're going to throw out the convictions as well. Yeah, mom and dad, they went too far on this. They were probably also wrong about drinking as well. They were probably also wrong about, the boyfriend and girlfriend stuff. We weren't allowed to do this, we weren't allowed to do that, and then they're just going to do whatever they want. They're going to do everything that the world is doing. And sometimes, it's the craziest thing, but sometimes kids who grow up in Baptist homes who aren't allowed to do anything, it is amazing how extreme they go into vileness as soon as they're out of their parents' house. They're a lot of times worse than lost kids. And why is that? And I personally think it's just because those kids from the Christian home have such a hatred for the things of God and for godliness. And so we've got to watch out. We don't want to turn our families away from the things of God. And so we better watch out and how far we go with these things. But again, those who typically yell the loudest are overcompensating because of areas where they are greatly lacking. This is why, little guys often talk the toughest. Why do they have to do that? The big guy, he doesn't need to talk tough. He's big. His size, his muscles speaks for itself. It's always the little guy. It's always the chihuahua that yaps the loudest. That's just the way it is. And we see it online. Dude, it's just like, man, pastors, they really need to help these guys that are preaching online. It's like they're always just wanting to get noticed. And so they do. As soon as they start getting a platform, they preach the most extreme on everything. And a lot of them, it's because they're just wanting attention. Okay? And if that's how they are, the last thing you ought to be doing is putting them in any kind of leadership role. Because that's what the whole Bible says, not a novice being lifted up with pride. And that's exactly what's happening. But a lot of it, too, is these guys, they don't know what they're talking about. They literally don't know what they're talking about. And again, the people we follow, it needs to be people who we can consider the end of their conversation. You would be much wiser to listen to the advice about standards from a guy who lived it, raised his kids in it, and they followed it, than the guy who's got kids 10 and under. You know how easy it is to get, listen, when your kids are small enough, you can dress them up in whatever you want. You can put them in matching clown suits, and they're not going to care when they're little kids. But when they get older and they start, have some awareness, they're not going to want to do that. And so just understand, I'm not impressed. I am not impressed, and I am not in any way influenced by the preacher who gets up preaching these hardcore standards for your family who only has little kids. I am not moved by that. He can get up and scream compromiser. He can call me a liberal. I am not influenced by people like that. They have no idea what they're talking about. As soon as their kids are teenagers, they're either going to change or they are going to drive them straight out of the IFB. I'm not intimidated by that at all. And so we need to watch out for these people. Do not follow these people. Do not feel obligated to do what they say. But they're saying it's Bible. Listen, just because they say it's Bible doesn't mean it is Bible. And some of these guys are good at, taking verses in the Bible and making something sound like it is a command. It's not. Make them convince you that it's actually scriptural before you just go following them. And so everybody's following somebody's standards, but I refuse to blindly follow the advice of someone who hasn't proved themselves. So another thing, turn over to Romans chapter 14. Don't run down people whose standards are lower or higher. Romans 14:10 says, "But why dost thou judge thy brother? Or why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, As I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God." So we're all going to give account of ourselves. So you need to make sure, are you setting standards because you're going to give an account to God someday, or because you're more afraid of facing your preacher? You're more afraid of facing that judgmental battle axe in the church. That's why a lot of people do the things that they do. Well, if I wear this, so-and-so in the church is going to judge me. Well, I would be more worried about the fact that God's going to judge me. We should think, what does God think about it? Who cares what somebody else in the church thinks about it? They're not the ones that have the authority over you in these areas, and we're not supposed to be judging in these things. And so we can call someone out for sin, but we can't necessarily call them out for standard. We've got to watch out for that. And understand, we can't call you out for being a hypocrite. Again, if you're that preacher going around and calling women heifers and stuff because they're wearing pants and your wife's doing it, we're going to call you out on that. I never looked at that guy the same after that day. The thing is, if he wasn't going around saying all that stuff, I wouldn't have judged him. The guy was a good preacher. I knew him personally. I liked him. He's dead and in heaven now. But I had a problem after that. It's like, I don't want to hear what he says about standards anymore. I want to go listen to the guy whose wife's actually submitting to him and following what he teaches. And so some people might need to be stricter in certain areas because of certain struggles that they have. Some people need higher standards for good reason. Some people want to get as far away as they can from a past that they're ashamed of. And so they might go farther than even what the Bible demands on some of those things. Maybe they were under so much bondage to alcohol that they just don't even want to go anywhere near it, to where they're not even going to go to a restaurant that serves alcohol or something like that. Don't criticize somebody if they have a standard like that. You know what? Respect that. And if you decide to take them out to eat, don't try to take them out to eat somewhere that's going to make them compromise their standard. And you know what? That disgusts me when people have standards in a church and then everybody wants to try to talk them out of that standard. No, if somebody has a stricter standard than you, don't try to get them to lower their standard to yours. No, you support them in it. You respect their standard when it comes to those things, because that might be what they need. They might need that for them. When it comes to television or something, they might be a lot more strict than you. You know what? Don't try to talk them into getting TV, and don't try to, if they're not going to watch anything that's, worse than rated G, don't try to talk them into watching a PG movie. Let them have their standard. They might need that. And you know what? Sometimes maybe we need to tighten up some of our standards. And just because you're convicted by their higher standard doesn't give you call to criticize them. And you know what? And just because you struggle with something, it doesn't mean everybody struggles with something. Just let people have their standards. They have their reasons. Some people, so in some churches, some standards we have, they're set to protect us from going certain directions or ending up in specific destinations. Again, because, for example, okay, our church has a lot of different standards, right? But there's also some convictions too. For example, for me, it is a conviction that we be a King James only church. That's a conviction for me. I don't ever want to get away from that. I don't want us ever correcting the King James Bible in this church, and I for sure don't want us using other versions of the Bible in this church. I want this to always be a King James only independent fundamental Baptist church. So because that, I want to keep certain standards in place that seem like always go before people lose their King James Bible. Okay? And again, I don't understand why all this is, but it is a fact that typically when the music goes, then the dress goes, and then the King James Bible goes. I don't know why that is. So you know what? I am just convinced if we continue the music standards, the dress standards we have in this church, I think that will help us keep our King James Bible. And you say those are completely unrelated. For some reason, they drop the standards, or they change the music, they change the dress standards, and then they change the Bible. And then a lot of them go Calvinist. And I definitely don't want to go there. But here's the thing too. If there's a guy out there who's not a Calvinist and he's still got a King James Bible, but maybe he sings some songs that are a little newer than the songs we sing, do I have a right to go around condemning him? Oh, it's direction, brother. I get that. But you know what I'm tired of, and I think we do this in the IFB world? I get the direction argument. I get that. And I often get concerned when I see people dropping certain standards and I feel like they're going a direction too. But to me, you can't really condemn somebody until they actually commit the sin. And I feel like what happens whenever people start changing their standards and we start seeing them go in that direction, it's almost like we push them over the edge. Because we're so mad that they're not following our lead when it comes to music and dress and all these superficial things, that it's like we've got to push them into sin so we can finally really nail them. And we drive people out of fellowship, we drive people out of the IFB, and you know what? I'm going to wait until they actually commit the sin. You know, I got called out. I got called out before, but I got called out recently again. I was told that I stood on the wrong side of the King James Bible. I was told I did. I was like, how did I stand on the wrong side of the King James Bible? I've always been King James only. I am King James only. But because I did not dump a pastor when he went to a conference with Calvinists and shared a link to the conference, which, by the way, I never clicked on that link. I had never watched anything. I don't even know what went on in that conference. But because I didn't dump this pastor when he did that, when this pastor told me I needed to, I was on the wrong side of the King James Bible. It's like, he's hanging out with Calvinists. And I remember I told him, it's like, he just preached a sermon on why I hate Calvinism. He's like, no, It was what I hate about Calvinism. I'm like, okay, means there's probably some things he likes. I was like, well, so, hey, when he starts preaching Calvinism, I'll dump him. But it's just like, listen, fine. If your standard, if you are so anti-Calvinist that you won't even fellowship with someone who shares a link to a Calvinist conference when they're not even preaching about Calvinism, then hey, that's your standard. But don't push that on me. That's dumb, in my opinion. I'm not trying to, I'm talking about not being critical about other people's standards. I apologize. I said what I thought, and I should have watched my mouth. But I'm not doing that. Okay? That is not my standard when it comes to these things. And so we got to be careful. Don't run down people's standards who are lower or higher than yours. That's really weird. Also acknowledge when it comes to standards that they are your personal standards and not necessarily God's command straight out of your KJV. We've got to do that. 1 Corinthians 7:25. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that is good for a man so to be. And he was talking about not being married. And now listen, I am not in any way saying that because Paul gave his opinion here that I am like on the same level of Paul and I can just, to go. I'm not doing that. Okay? And Paul wrote this in the inspiration of the Holy Ghost. I think his judgment was good. It was also for this present distress. I'm using this to show that sometimes we are going to face things and face situations where we do not have a direct command from the Scriptures. And when we don't have a direct command from the Scriptures, what we have to do is we have to make judgment ourselves. And that judgment that we will make will be based on the present situation. And you have your MGTOW clowns out there who go to 1 Corinthians 7 and basically teach that Paul taught it's better to not get married. And it's just like, no, he was speaking about a very specific situation in a very specific time. And he said, for this present distress, I think you're better off right now remaining unmarried. But that's just my opinion, he said. If you're married, you've not sinned. And so in this completely different situation, a completely different time, to make that same judgment and then to act like it's a command, that's ridiculous. And I think your judgment is bad on these things. I think Paul's judgment was good because he was somebody who was full of the Holy Ghost. But I'm just saying, we don't have commands for everything in the Bible. So what you have to do is you have to set a standard. But what some preachers will do, it's like they will try to literally pull a command out of the Bible and act like it's Bible. Like, for example, if you just said, Pastor, what's your standard for level of violence in video games? I mean, obviously we shouldn't be playing these bloody, gory ones, but what about smashing a Goomba, on Mario or something like that? So between smashing a Goomba and hacking somebody up on Mortal Kombat, what's your standard, Pastor? Okay. Now, I haven't taken the time to think of a standard on that yet. But it would be dumb for me to go and try to show a Bible verse and here's the command. There's no commands about video games in the Bible. Okay? But again, so what we can do, we can take principles and we can make judgment when it comes to those things. But, if some of us have land a little bit differently on those things, then we can't necessarily declare the other one a liberal or the other one in sin or something like that. We've got to watch out for that. And so there are many areas where we are allowed to make judgment. Just keep it where you have authority. Always keep it where you have authority. And so, for example, as a pastor, I have certain personal standards, too, for how I interact with other women. Okay? But a person in another business, they might not be able to live up to that standard that I have. I'm not going to be alone in this building, with another woman. But depending on somebody's job and their work situation, they might not be able to do that. They might not be able to live up to that standard. I'm not going to get in a car alone with another woman. It's like, yeah, but what if I'm a taxi driver? So obviously, so again, you might have to adjust the standard, but you still got to have safeguards, right? So, obviously, when it comes to the Bible. We're not supposed to fornicate. There's certain things that we know we're not supposed to do. Also, we want to abstain from appearance of evil and things like that. But again, the safeguards that we put in place, that might vary. And so for me, as a pastor in my situation, when I set a standard for myself, I can't declare that as like something everybody's got to follow for every situation. Everybody's got to make judgment for them. And again, depending on where you work, depending on the type of place, just, are there other people around? Can people show up at any moment? Are there windows? I mean, there's all kinds of things you have to factor in, and all of us have to have wisdom and make judgment, and then we set standards accordingly. That's the way these things are supposed to work. And so, if a situation arises too where you violate that standard, you haven't sinned. And I remember years ago, my dad always had that standard. I don't give rides to other women unless I have somebody with me. Sometimes there would be ladies who would call one a ride to church, and my dad would go pick them up, but he would always take some of his kids with him. He would do that for accountability. My dad had that as a standard, but I remember one time he talked about how there was a lady he saw go in a ditch in a snowstorm, and it was really bad out, and he gave her a ride. Hey, oh man, he dropped the standard. He made a judgment in that situation, and I think it was good. It's okay, you don't let a lady freeze to death, in a perilous situation because of your standard. Okay? It's a standard. It's a safeguard that you have in place, and so it's okay to do that. Sometimes we might have to make some adjustments on those things, and you're not sinning when you do that. There are certain situations where you might have to adapt. You might have to change some things, and there's a lot of situations like that. And so, lastly, too, just when it comes to standards, make sure you have respect for other people's standards. And what I mean by that, we're not going to take time to read all of it, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, it talks about eating meat, and we don't want to offend people with the things that they eat. We don't want to violate somebody's weak conscience. The Apostle Paul, he talked about to the Jew, I became as a Jew and all that. And so when it comes to standards too, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Now never sin. If somebody has like no standards and there's like an expectation to do something that you don't believe in, you don't have to do that. But if, for example too, this always bothers me, but you have families that do have strict standards, and then all of a sudden, the girls get married, and then they drop all the standards, and then at the family functions, and they're not following what they were taught. I think you ought to respect your parents' standards and those things. If I went and I dropped my standards and I was doing something different than what my parents taught me, I'm not going to go rub it in their face when I'm at their house, because what are you going to do, Dad? Give me a spanking? No, I'm going to honor my father, and I'm going to honor their standard. If this isn't something if this isn't a way he would want people dressing at his house, I'm not going to dress in that way. When we go to camps and things, we follow their standards. When we're on their turf, we follow their standards. Why? Even if they're stricter than our standards, we're going to follow them. You know why? Because we are respecting them on their turf. And there's camps that we've been to where they have standards that are stricter than my personal standards, and I follow their standards. And I don't think I'm being a hypocrite when I do that. I'm being respectful. I'm on their turf. I was at one camp where at their camp, they even have you go swimming in pants. And you know what I did when I went swimming? I wore pants. Now, when I'm not there swimming, I don't wear pants swimming everywhere. I hate wearing pants swimming. That is not fun. But I wanted to go water skiing, and so I followed their rules. And that's just being respectful. And if I go into a church and they have stricter standards, some churches don't believe in colored shirts. That's not my standard. But if I'm on their turf, I'm following their standard. And because I'm showing respect. But you know what all these people, all these former IFBers want to do whenever they dump those standards and they get out of there? They'll show up to these things flaunting their liberalism and stuff. We don't need to do that kind of thing. Listen, I know preachers that, I know of one in particular, he did not believe in facial hair on men. He wouldn't let preachers preach behind his pulpit if they had facial hair. And I think that's over the top, but that was his standards. But, and I knew people too, who, when they would go to his church, they would shave for him. because they had enough respect for him. They were willing to lose their beard, and they would do that for him. But they would admit, when I shaved, it was for him. But for the Lord, they didn't think the Lord cared. And I don't think he does care if you have a beard, by the way. but he did for them. That's just showing respect. That's honoring. And if you are with someone, and if you're a family, your parents, whatever, and they have stricter standards or higher standards, whatever, it's okay to follow those things. That's just being respectful. It's not you pretending that you don't dress other ways. That's not it. It's just you being respectful. And so, and let me just say this too. Those who do not continue following their Bible college's standards, they were not being fake while they were in Bible college. They are not compromisers. Listen, I totally get the over-the-top standards they have in Bible colleges. I get that. They are trying to control young adults. They're controlling people who legally are adults but are still teenagers. And so, of course, they need these standards. I get it. I get these rules. I get why they're so over the top. I totally get it. And when Tommy went to college for a year, I told him, I was like, hey, they're going to go back to treating you like a teenager. I've been letting you live like an adult for the last few years. You're going to go back to being a teenager. They're going to tell you everything to do. They're going to tell you what to wear. They're going to be picky about these things. And I said, and you know what? You are going to follow their rules and respect them. You know why? Because nobody's making you go there. You're signing up to go there. All these people that go to Bible college and act like, oh, I got out of a cult. No, you went and paid to join a cult, if that's the case. Listen, nobody made you go there. That cult gave you a handbook telling you all the expectations they were going to have of you. And the military's not a cult. They've got stricter dress standards. They've got stricter rules. They dictate everything you do. You signed up for that. You didn't get drafted. You didn't get drafted into Bible college. You didn't get drafted in the military. And so you know what? Deal with it. Follow these things. Show respect. And so everyone has standards. Standards are good, but they are things that one personally applies to their own life, and they help keep them in obedience to God. But the standards are not the command. The standards are the markers we personally place in our life to help us remain obedient and to prevent ourselves from drifting into disobedience. And they for sure are not for us to use so we can lift up ourselves and beat down other Christians. When we do, it makes us a hypocrite, and it makes us disobedient in more important areas. Did you know that? It makes us more disobedient. And so learn to distinguish the difference between a real Bible command and a standard. When a preacher preaches against something or promotes something that you should or shouldn't do, is it a command or is it a standard? Learn to tell the difference. And so that if you'll do that, I believe it will help you have standards without compromise as later on in your life. And so with that, let's pray to your Lord. I thank you so much for the blessing of your word and the things we can learn from it. Help us to have wisdom when it comes to our standards, Lord. We don't want to get caught up in lasciviousness and worldliness. But Lord, just help us not to be self-righteous and a bunch of hypocritical Pharisees at the same time. Help us to have grace with other people, and help us to be patient, and help us just to stay in our lane and where we have authority. In your name we pray. Amen.